The buyer's leaky bucket and why it matters to you. Procurement is under pressure to continually cut costs. However, a high level of leakage means delivering on all the promised savings is a real challenge. So, how successful are your customers at realizing savings within their business? And most importantly, in respect of your category of goods and services. That matters to the seller because if savings are not being realized, that can send procurement in search of further supplier price cuts. Suppliers who can help buyers to reduce the leakage of savings can reduce the pressure on their own margins. Behind procurement's image as the cost-cutting supremo is the reality of a hard-won fight to cut spend. Delivering promised or budgeted savings can be a real challenge. Think of it as a leaky bucket. The bucket contains the promised or targeted savings and it is being continuously topped up. The only problem is that the bucket of promised savings is leaking and leaking fast. That puts more pressure on procurement to keep adding more and more promised savings, to bring more areas of spend under control and to negotiate harder with suppliers, for example. All the while, a significant proportion of what is promised is spilling out onto the floor. Procurement is targeted with or wants to save 10% this year, for example, and more again next year. But how much of that figure can actually be delivered upon and by when? Well, let's look at what happens to promised savings in many organisations. Let's look at the holes in the bucket. It's a harsh reality that the savings touted by procurement are regularly discounted by finance. Perhaps the numbers just don't stack up or cannot be recorded in the company's accounts. From an accounting perspective, procurement can find it difficult to take credit unless the savings can be linked back to an item of spending in last year's accounts, for example. So cost avoidance claims are regularly discounted. The next source of leakage occurs because people don't, can't or won't follow the rules. This happens in the case of maverick spending, unplanned purchases and rushed orders, for example. Managing what is spent is key, however it can be a challenge. Such out-of-bounds purchases or budget overruns eat into the planned savings. Sometimes they could account for up to 30% of the procurement savings leakage in an organisation. Even if approved suppliers are used and procurement processes followed, the full savings or other benefits are not guaranteed. They don't automatically follow. Savings go unrealized as a result of poor contract management, for example, where terms agreed are not reviewed to ensure that full discounts or rebates are achieved. Or it may be because of a failure to keep suppliers in check and poor supplier performance management. It's not hard to imagine how the level of leakage here could be anywhere between 5 and 25%. The cost of goods and services bought is only part of the cost savings picture. Some of the savings achieved will inevitably be consumed in administration, and the other activities involved in sourcing, storing, tracking and paying for the goods. With more procedures and paperwork involved in buying, these costs are rising. This is important because in some organisations, procurement costs can account for more than 50% of the cost of the goods and services purchases. Many companies are leaking potential savings because of their sourcing strategy and in particular the proliferation of suppliers. Every new supplier adds extra cost. So too does every new stock keeping unit. That includes the cost of supplier selection and management, inventory management, order and payment processing, etc. But it also includes the failure to leverage the best prices by placing larger orders with fewer suppliers. Complexity drives costs. The opportunity for savings can be lost because what is purchased has been overspecified. For example, where a brand name product or component is specified by engineering or design. Maybe a cheaper, less feature-rich version would do in some situations. So what are the leakages for your buyers and customers? What is it that is putting pressure on their numbers? Understanding the reality of your buyer's savings is important. If as a seller you can help the buyer to plug some of the leakages, you can take some of the pressure off your own numbers and in particular your margins. That's because if the buyer's savings are leaking away, there is pressure to drive down your prices. With a leaky bucket, you need to either put more into it to compensate for the leaks or to stop it from leaking in the first place. Let's look at how you can do that, taking each of the leaks and exploring how the seller can address them. When it comes to savings that are being discredited or disbelieved within the organization, the seller can help the buyer to get credit for savings. That means the seller should know the buyer's key performance indicators, know the difference between soft and hard savings, and understand what savings can be claimed. When it comes to savings lost due to poor compliance, the seller can help the buyer to manage spend better. In particular, the seller can help with spend analysis and tracking, integrate with the buyer's systems, for example e-catalogs and e-invoicing, or help the buyer to win over internal customers and stakeholders. When it comes to savings that are unrealized, the seller can help the buyer to realize more planned savings. In particular, the seller can help with spend analysis and tracking again, focus on communicating and realizing benefits and savings, and engage in contract and performance reviews on an ongoing basis. The seller can also help the buyer to cut procurement costs. Specifically, the seller can find ways to cut the buyer's total cost of acquisition, promote electronic order submission, payment processing, etc., help the buyer to reduce warehousing, shipment and other costs. Having too many suppliers is an important source of lost savings. The seller can help the buyer consolidate suppliers. For example, the seller can show the savings available by cutting suppliers and SKUs, promote framework agreements and longer-term contracts for supply. When it comes to the costs of overly complex or rigid specifications, the seller can help here too. The seller can help revisit the specifications, highlighting where cheaper alternatives exist within your product range and presenting the buyer with options, encouraging the earlier involvement of procurement in the planning phase of projects, new product development, etc. Value engineering, re-engineering of products and purchases where specifications are rewritten to give procurement greater sourcing freedom. The motivation for implementing any of these strategies is more than simple altruism. In addition to taking pressure off margins, it can help the seller to become more important and more strategic to the buyer. For more on this topic, please visit Buyer Insights.